Welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live streaming interview series, where leading new thought teachers, speakers, and authors share the intimate stories behind the 10 best spiritual books that inspired them the most on their spiritual journey. From well-known classics to hidden gems you might never have heard of, the No BS Spiritual Book Club saves you time and money by sharing reliable recommendations from those who've walked the path before you. The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only No BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome. Joining me today to share the 10 books that had the biggest impact on his life journey is spiritual gangster, mystic, goofy seeker, and host of the Broader Lens podcast, Booboo Garcia. Booboo Garcia grew up sensing he had lived many lives, but growing up in Southern California amid gang culture, addiction, and trauma, he fell into the illusion of separateness until, after years of struggling with alcohol addiction, his identity dissolved in what he describes as a glimpse of Nirvana, which awakened him to a deeper reality beyond his former self. Booboo Garcia, welcome.
Thank you for having me on.
So, you have said that you didn't really read very well as a child, and it took some time before you really got into books. Tell me just a little bit about that.
Yeah, I don't know if it was part of my upbringing or what. I could never pay attention in school. It just bored the heck out of me, if that makes sense. And yeah, I just never really learned to learn much in school. I couldn't pay attention. I had maybe attention disorder. I don't know, but I just never was really interested in school. So I'm sorry.
No, you continue.
When I had my awakening, I started to seek, like that Rumi quote, what you're seeking is seeking you. But when I first came in, and I'll get into it when I get to the first book, I had to learn how to read. And I had someone take the time and teach me how to use a dictionary and, give me an understanding and teach me what words were, because I had a very low reading comprehension.
And now you can't stop.
Correct.
Particularly with the job you're in. Having to read books for your interviews, yeah. So, are you kind of a voracious reader now?
It's weird. Like I read what I need to read in a book. I don't read from cover to cover. I might start off in the center. I might start off at the ending. It's just weird. I just let my intuition lead me.
Oh, you Philistine. People are always telling me off because I'll often say, I'll read the end before I read the beginning. Yeah, it's interesting. Everyone has a different way of taking in their information. So, tell me a little bit about what happened after your awakening experience.
Well, I had my once I had that glimpse of Nirvana. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I didn't. I was guided to, which I picked the first book, Alcoholics Anonymous. That's the name of the book. But I was guided to that program because I was suffering. Carl Jung said there's no coming to consciousness without pain, and I was in so much pain. I woke up, and once I woke up, I became open-minded, and I finally started to see that I had a major problem. Like I always say, when I came to the 12-step community, my first language wasn't English or Spanish. It was Victimese. And I always blamed everyone else. And I never had the ability to look at myself. And for the first time in my life, I was able to look at me and the harm I've caused myself and others.
Wow. That's a very courageous thing to acknowledge.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about this book then. How did this book impact your life journey?
Well, for one, it's the first book I've ever read and where I learned how to read. And I read the book cover to cover. It's not something I just read, but it's something I apply and study. And so anytime I read any book now, I have to have a pen and a highlighter. I can't read. I have to have the physical book in my hand. And I just don't read a book. I study it. And I didn't know how to read. So it was hard for me. So I had to memorize stuff. I had to read it over and over. And I didn't try to memorize it, but I ended up memorizing it because I didn't know how to read it. So I read it over and over until it clicked. But what that book did for me was it taught me how to live on a spiritual basis. It taught me how to take responsibility for my own life and my own actions, which I never did before. I always had these blame throwers on the side of my shoulders and I had to push them away. And really just, I think that's what spirituality is taking responsibility for my daily actions. I love what David Icke always says. I love the word ignorance because it's an extension of the word ignore. And I ignored my daily life for a very long time. Everyone else was the problem, not me. So the more I ignored that, the more ignorant I became. But through the practice of mindfulness and broadening my awareness and being more present and retraining the mind and body to live in the present moment, everything started to change for me. But I started to realize the nature of my suffering and my alcoholism, my alcohol addiction, and pill popping problem. And at the core of it is really trauma, which is what the 12 steps does not talk about. It doesn't touch on, which I'll touch on later in another book.
It must have been an incredible period in your life because so much was happening at once. Not only did you have this incredible perceptual shift, but then you're being exposed to all these new things. This book, the idea of taking responsibility, confronting yourself. That must have been really hard.
It was and it wasn't, if that makes sense, because I was in so much pain. I was just open. I was an open book, and I started to see for the first time in my life, like I said, clearly the harm I've caused. And in that book, Alcoholics Anonymous, it says that the alcoholic is like a tornado roaring through the lives of others. And I started to see all the harm this tornado caused through my unconscious ways of living and my unresolved trauma and these trapped emotions that fogged up my perception and kept me on survival mode and being a victim. And with that comes emotions, and I had to drown those with alcohol. How to drown that with alcohol.
Wow. I cannot even begin to imagine. Well, let's move on to book number 2. Are these books in chronological order of how you read them?
They're actually not. I there was a couple, like the second book, I should have put that a little bit later, but the second book was very important for me, which is Gabor Mate's book, right? And
In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts.
In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, because he really brought in my perception and my understanding of what addiction really is. See, the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous was written in 1939. And the problem with that, and I love the fellowship, it's helped a lot of people, but I always challenge it to continue to grow because we know so much more about the mind and body and addiction, neuroscience, epigenetics. We know so much more than they did in the 1939. So I started to get a deeper understanding, but I also started to become pushed away from my own fellowship that helped me because I started to share new information because unfortunately dogma finds its way in a lot of groupthink or institutions. And that's what happened for me. But it's very dangerous to think that the big book, even though it helped a lot of people and it's a beautiful book, is the word of God. And to some people, many people, it was channeled by God. And I always say, if it was channeled by God, then why is the science off? But Gabor Mate really got my attention because he studied a lot of the mystics that I studied. And during my awakening, mysticism came to me like really fast. And I wasn't raised with any of this stuff. Maybe we'll touch on that a little bit later. But he had the Gospel of Thomas in there. He had Thich Nhat Hanh. He had Eckhart Tolle. It just Rumi. Like he just started. So it really tuned me in. But really just talking about trauma. And when I use the word trauma, it's for having understanding, not being a victim. I'm a trauma survivor, and I never talk like that. But it's really just having a deeper understanding on how it affects our brain development when we're a child and getting into our adult life and creates these behavior patterns, misunderstandings and confusion, and how it disconnects. I love what Peter Levine says. Trauma is a disconnection of self. And I think that's what the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous calls a spiritual malady. So now I need something to feel whole, and that's why I drink. You know, but when you clear, you start to work on your traumas, your resentments, your anger, and your behavior patterns. You can recover from addiction, because addiction really means a slave, has something to do with being a slave. The old addictus, the word for addiction, the root word addictus means has something to do with slavery, and I was a slave to this habit, this substance, and these behaviors for a very long time. So yeah, I really love that, and I love how he really utilized the word, expands on the word trauma in Greek means wound, and I could see where I was wounded psychologically and physically, emotionally. So having that awareness really just changed everything. The big book, the first book, it talks about having an allergy of the body, outdated science. Makes sense in the beginning, could be used as an analogy, but Gabor talks about the dopamine receptors and how it produces dopamine and gives me that sense of relief. But the more I chronically use, the more those receptors become desensitized, so I'm always going to need more.
Yeah. Incredible. Book number 3 is Man's Eternal Quest, Collected Talks and Essays on Realizing God in Daily Life by Paramahansa Yogananda and the Self-Realization Fellowship. That was published in 1982.
Yeah, I love Yogananda. His teachings. I was talking to Matthew Fox, and he talked about having a dream of Miser Eckhart coming to him, and Yogananda came to me after my awakening, and I never heard of the guy. Grew up in gangs, wasn't raised with spirituality or religion, but I felt guided by Yogananda for the first 5 years of my life. And it's crazy because when I was a kid, I always felt as if I lived in India at another time. I remember watching some shows and knowing that environment, just like ancient China and so on. But I wanted to pick autobiography of a yogi, but everyone picks it on your show. So, but Man's Eternal Quest really taught me about, the meaning of a Swami, someone that's one with self. And also when you put it in front of a name, it means holy one to a religious person. Just really teaching me about what an avatar is and giving me a better understanding and removing prejudices and discrimination I had towards Christianity and Jesus. And really give me a better understanding of who Jesus was, because I think the Swamis understand Jesus better than most pastors, in my opinion. And looking at Krishna, sharing the universal consciousness of the mystics, really helping broaden, because that's what I started to experience within me. And just understanding, the second coming of Christ is the awakening within you. And that made more sense to me. So he really just helped me broaden my understanding, my awareness. And I spent a lot of time at his lake shrine in Pacific Palisades in California, and I sat with Yogananda, and I just felt like I got downloaded stuff. I remember one day I'm sitting at the lake shrine, and there's a statue of Jesus with the river going into the lake. There's a statue of Krishna on the other side with the river going into the lake, and there's the Buddha kind of hidden with a river of rocks going into the lake, guiding everyone back to the big lake anonymously. The Buddha. I really, that all made sense to me. Like Miser Eckhart say, the mystics will understand, theologians will argue. So I started to understand this universal truth.
Oh, that's fascinating. I used to spend a lot of time in the Self-Realization Fellowship down in Encinitas when I lived in San Diego. It's such a beautiful, peaceful place. I often go there in my mind.
Wow.
How long did it take you to understand who it was that was with you? I mean, if you never knew who he was.
That's a great question, because I was homeless, and I don't know if we'll get into my story a little bit later, but a childhood friend that reached out to me and let me stay in his place for my first year. He had 2 books and I'll get into the other book later, but they happened to be Neil Donald Walsh and Yogananda. Mind you, I didn't pay attention to those books. I didn't even read yet. But later I realized those are the books. But I felt like Yogananda always was trying to talk to me. One day I started to see this face of Yogananda, a book, a picture. it seemed like everywhere I go, I hear his name all of a sudden. I remember one day I went to church service, and I don't know the difference. Like I said, I wasn't raised with religion or anything, so I'm sitting in church, and I'm listening to this pastor speak, and it was like my first time going to church, and he says he knows not what he speaks. I heard a voice tell me that, and um, so I get up and I leave for some reason. I go into the gift shop. I asked for a book by Neil Donald Walsh, and they said that's on the no buy list. They looked it up, and then I went to a couple weeks later. I go to a Unity church, and then I hear a guest speaker, guest reverend from San Diego, coming to Torrance, California to give a service, and he's talking about Yogananda, and it's like everywhere I went, I heard this Yogananda guy, and I felt someone talking to me. Sometimes just with the voice, and other times intuitively, just an emotion speaking through me through emotion. And so I eventually found my way to Ananda Fellowship and Self Realization Fellowship. And I would sit in SRF service, and I would see the lineup of all the Swamis, and Yogananda's picture was really, really bright, and it was like alive to me versus the other Swamis and Jesus, the other avatars. And that was, I think that was his way of showing like he's guiding me. So yeah, it just so many different things like that has started to pop up for me. He even told me don't worship his self-realization, have my own.
Yeah, yeah. So what happened when he left you? Were you
Uh,
bereft?
I don't know when ever he left, but it just started to dissolve, and I moved on, and I started to learn about other types of teachings from other, because I had a lot. I would be sleeping, and I would literally feel Gandhi or Mother Teresa or other types of beings around me in my sleep, and constantly in my thoughts, like I felt like in my presence, if that makes sense. It's really interesting, and something I can never picture even experiencing.
Mhm. Well, book number 4 is Conversations with God by Neil Donald Walsh, which was published in 1998. And you found this book in Targets of all places.
Yeah, what happened for me? It was weird. I went to Target in Torrance, California, one time, and actually, it wasn't the book; it was the DVD. And it seemed, and this happened to me twice, in my life, and it seemed like everything got dim, but there was something staring at me with the little light on, and that was his DVD, and it said "Conversations with God." I'm like, And mind you, I didn't know that book was in the living room with Yogananda's book. I felt like that was always meant for me, but I just never paid attention to it until later it clicked. But his DVD, I felt like it was speaking to me. It was trying to get my attention. So I grabbed it, bought it, and watched it. And that's when I asked that church, I started looking for his book. But that book really helped me because in the 12-step community, going through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, it tells me to choose my own conception of God. And when they told me that in the beginning, I'm like, oh, this God thing, this God that destroyed a lot of people's cultures. And, I thought about the Abrahamic old belief system that I was conditioned in the West with. But being able to have my own conception, I was open to this God thing because I seen something working in people. So I was open to it. I was really open minded, and he really helped broaden my awareness on this thing some people call God by reading his books, trying to read his books and have a better understanding. And what I like about that book is he said even the gospel writers didn't know Jesus. I'm like, what? And really took me down a rabbit hole. Even Hitler didn't go to hell. And I'm like, whoa, which matches Corinthians. If God is love and doesn't keep record of wrongdoing, then it throws away the judging, punishful God, like Thomas Paine would say. A judging God makes a cruel person. So
Yeah. Mm. Book number 5, Living Buddha, Living Christ, Thich Nhat Hanh, published in 1997. You said that this had one of the most profound impacts on you. Why was that?
I love that man. He's taught me so much. Why? Because understanding is love's other name, and that's something he taught me. Without deep understanding, I don't have the ability to truly love myself and others. And I had so much layers of hate, anger, trauma, hurt, pain, um, misunderstanding. And when I started to open up that book, what really touched me was Gnosticism, because Elaine Pagels wrote something in the very beginning of his book, and the Gospel of Thomas came to me early on as well, and so she's doing writings about that, and and I told Marianne Williamson this. I don't know if Thich Nhat Hanh realized this, but he became the living Buddha, the living Christ. You know, and he just spoke in such a poetic way, and I love what Matthew Fox always says: the mystics are poets of the soul, and he just had a way of speaking to me through his writings and his deep understanding of himself and the human condition. And I love how he talked about loving fruit salad, meaning there's truth in every religion, every spiritual practice. The problem is the belief systems that creates the division. And just give me a new perspective of who Jesus was, or the Buddha, and yeah, it just really it was just a beautiful experience. I truly believe understanding is love's other name. And a quick example for that is one day when I moved to Ohio and I experienced some racism there. And I never really had that problem in Los Angeles, but in Ohio. And a guy says, I hate Mexican people. And I realized already how my environment influenced me and taught me how to believe certain things in my own conditioning, and I seen that in him, where I didn't have to get responsive in a negative way. I had that understanding where I can be, not saying I like his behavior, but I can understand it where I don't have to react in a negative way.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. Book number 6 is Meister Eckhart, A Mystic Warrior for Our Times by Matthew Fox, published in 2014.
One thing I love about the mystics, and I started to feel kind of like an outcast in the 12-step community because I started to think outside the box or the group think. And I noticed that the mystics understood me. They've been guiding me from the beginning, and they all been kind of crucified or condemned in some kind of way by their own religion, their own institution. And I heard the universal consciousness of the mystics in all of them. Like I said earlier, the mystics will understand, theologians will argue. So looking at Meister Eckhart and how he was able to be a deep thinker and seer, I think the mystics are seers. I always say many people can read the music, very few hear the melody, and fewer still can sing the song. And the mystics can do all three. And just looking at how they all understood each other, whether it be with Thich Nhat Hanh or it be Black Elk or Carl Jung. Meister Eckhart had a huge influence on everybody, even Thomas Merton. He said something that was profound, and he said, I pray God to rid me of God. And Thich Nhat Hanh said something even very similar, and he said the Buddha was not against God; he was only against the notions of God that are mere mental constructions that do not correspond to reality. So I started to I look at how these beliefs and these conceptions can block us from the ultimate reality if we don't really be open-minded, open to just new information, and not so much information, but more importantly, having the experience.
Book number 7, A New Earth, Awakening to Your Life's Purpose by Eckhart Tolle, published in 2005.
One of my favorite books to this day. It had such a huge impact on me because A New Earth for me is a shift in perception, like Marianne says, from fear to love. And I just all that. I remember one day I'm in, I don't know if I was in the store. I was in a store, and I seen everyone in a box. It was weird, and I seen everyone trapped into different belief systems, which creates a disconnection from the rest of humanity. And I realized that was what I was a part of. I was in a box of beliefs, but I became more aware of the ego, not just at the individual ego, but the collective ego. One thing I don't agree with Eckhart Tolle is that the ego is completely negative. But the ego's not your amigo if you're unconscious of it. And I was unconscious of my ego for a very long time. Eckhart Tolle really taught me about the voice in the head. But he taught me about the collective ego and the dogma that comes with it, and the disconnection, the us against them mentality is very similar to the individual ego, but it's more stronger and more easier to create chaos if you're stuck in a collective ego. And I think the mysticism, they were away from those collectives. They could see beyond that. And Eckhart Tolle also showed me the beauty of religion as well, because religion could be very negative, but it can also have some beauty and treasure in that as well. And each spiritual tradition carries the same similar, like I said earlier, the universal consciousness of the mystics in it. There's always some treasure in there. But yeah, just having deep understanding, being more aware of the voice in the head. And he also explained something. He explained one of my spiritual experiences in that book as well. So I really just really appreciate that flowering of consciousness that he continued to expand on for humanity.
Well, we're going to take a short break now. You're listening to a No BS Spiritual Book Club interview and sharing his 10 best list of the most inspirational books today is self-confessed spiritual gangster and host of the Borderlands podcast, Booboo Garcia. We'll be back with more from Booboo Garcia after this break. And also, I want to find out what being a spiritual gangster really means. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Om Times TV.
Maya Angelou once said that there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and when I'm not hosting Om Times Media's flagship radio show What Is Going On and the No BS Spiritual Book Club, I help people share their untold stories. Books are my life, my joy and my passion, and there is no greater reward than helping aspiring writers get their books out of their heads and into the hands of those who are waiting to read them. If you feel that you have a book in you but don't know where to begin, visit Sedgbeer.com. Click on the Work With Me tab and find out how my experience helping others tell their stories might be just what you've been looking for. That's Sedgbeer.com, Sedgbeer.com.
Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. Om Times Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, Om Times offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an Om Times magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on Om Times TV and broadcasting it across the extensive Om Times radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. Om Times. Open yourself to the possibilities.
Everything that we do, we can do in a contemplative manner. Through the art of contemplation, you can use the gene keys in a really powerful way. Gene keys is basically the code book of life. In the gene keys, the book is made up of these three levels: shadows, gifts, and siddhis. And the journey is through those three levels, kind of unpicking of the shadow states, the releasing of the gifts, and then the embodying of this higher consciousness called the siddhi. And the siddhis are very exalted words. And it's not like we kind of suddenly are all these exalted Christ-like beings, but we have flashes and illuminations along the journey. And the more we get stuck into the journey, the more illumination comes to us, because the more we're releasing the light from in these codes inside our DNA. So all those revelations are inside us. So the contemplative way is the inner way.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back. Booboo Garcia, book number 8, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. How to Lose Your Mind and Create a New One. Joe Dispenza, 2013. I mean, you really did break the habit of being yourself.
Yeah, thank you. That's the second book that's the second book that I had that experience, like Neil Donald Walsh's book, if that makes sense. I remember one day praying because I always felt I was questioning the 12-step community with the science behind it. I felt like there's something more about addiction and about the mind and the body that they're not getting. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I just want to continue to know and expand and grow. And I started praying and meditating, asking for some guidance. And a couple of days later, I'm in Ohio and I'm at a Barnes Noble, and a book starts to get my attention, and it seemed similar to Neil Donald Walsh. Everything got a little dimmer, and it was a little bit more brighter than everything else. And it was Joe Dispenza's work, and then he gave me a lot of confirmation from that, from what I've been experiencing. And I'm not crazy, because a groupthink can make you feel like you're crazy if you're not thinking the same. You become a heretic. And I love the word heretic, the Greek word, because it means to have your own choice, to think for yourself, basically. And orthodox means to think straight, you know. So I wasn't feeling. I wasn't feeling alone with reading his stuff. And one thing I love what he explained is that thinking feeling loop. And if I put that to alcoholism, I was stuck in a thinking feeling drinking loop for a very long time. And he taught me about my habits and gave me more awareness. Talked about that Hebb's law, nerve cells that wire together, fire together, and neurons that no longer fire together, no longer wire together. And neuroplasticity, there's that saying, thank God for neuroplasticity. And I don't need something outside of myself to fix me. I can create a new me, a new mind. If our thoughts can make us sick, can they make us well? He really shined the light on that. And I had a problem with going into 12-step meetings saying I am an alcoholic. And I started to question that. It's a custom, and I think it's an unconscious custom. And I think that creates a lot of harm. And can that recreate relapse by saying that over and over? And that one thing I like about Joe Dispenza, he says, repeated conscious thoughts become unconscious thinking. So it just really brought in that awareness. And I love how he talks about in that book, the Tibetan language for meditate means to become familiar with. And I'm like, wow, that's powerful, because it could be used as a synonym for self-observation or self-development. And like I said, I became more aware, being more of the observer. And that Sanskrit word for meditation means to cultivate self. And I think that's the essence of who I am is consciousness. It's awareness. But he taught me how to cultivate and be the gardener of my own mind, my own thoughts, and really just taking more responsibility. And one of the most beautiful things he says in there is that our thoughts are the language of the mind, and our emotions are the language of the body. And I spoke fear for a very long time, that language. And I learned how to speak from the language of the heart by learning how to live on a spiritual basis. And like Bruce Limpton would say, fear has an opposite effect on the mind and body than love does. So I started to be more loving and more kind, not just to myself, but to others as well. And I think that's been a major difference maker for me.
I think you're absolutely right when you said that about, I am an alcoholic. I think it's important to acknowledge something and then let it go. Because to say I am is that you are telling your body over and over and over again. It's a suggestion. It's a hypnotic suggestion. And it does surprise me that they continue with that. Put it where it was. I was.
Yeah, you're right. And I didn't feel like that was my truth anymore. I can't go on with 15 years of sobriety saying I'm an alcoholic because alcoholics drink. I think what it's meant to do, we're meant to do is take someone through that book that's new, suffering from alcoholism, and them say, hey, that's me. But to repeat that over and over is very dangerous, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. Book number 9, The Anunnaki of Nibiru, Mankind's Forgotten Creators, Enslavers, Saviors, and Hidden Architects of the New World Order by Gerald R. Clark. What a title. Published in 2013.
I love Gerald Clark. He passed away a few years back, but he got guys like Matthew LaCroix or Billy Carson going, and he was like their big brother, in my opinion. And Gerald Clark just opened the door because when I was a kid, I always felt like I remember watching Star Trek or Star Wars, and I felt like I've been there in that type of life before. And that's kind of weird being a Mexican kid from Los Angeles thinking that way. So I didn't really talk about that stuff to people. But Gerald Clark really helped broaden my lens on, maybe the human origins. Like, is it possible? It makes more sense. Okay, Yahweh, down that explains why Yahweh had a big ego and is kind of a crazy warlord, a jealous god. So he started, were they the Anunnaki part of it? Was that Enlil? Learning about Anu and Enki and Enlil and how we've been genetically modified. That just really just gave me more food for thought. And I was always into that kind of stuff, even before my awakening with ancient history. I just wasn't into the spiritual part, but I believe it all goes together. And yeah, he made me feel not alone, and he gave me a lot of food for thought. And one of the most beautiful things in his work in that book is he eventually met with Mauro Bellino, and they did an episode together, and how Mauro Bellino and Gerald Clark's work in his book with the Anunnaki, they went hand in hand. And he was so excited with conversating with Mauro, but he was just a hero of mine because he really got me going. Even the Lord's Prayer, on earth as it is in heaven. And that's what Anunnaki means. Those who came from heaven to earth. Are they talking about Anu? Yeah, I don't know. I love to question things, and just really, it helps expand. So, and he showed me how there was the main Ijiji to revolt against from the slave work his name was Allah. Is that a coincidence? I'm not saying that's Allah and Islam, but just having that food for thought, showing the timelines and all these different characters and how it influenced Christianity and Judaism is pretty amazing to me, especially with the ziggurats. You see the ziggurats in Mesopotamia, very similar to Mesoamerica, and then you find some of these Anunnaki symbology, these handbags and everything in both places. So just very interesting to me.
Have you read Paul Wallace's latest book?
I haven't read his latest book, but I have a few of his books. There's one right there, right next to the Anunnaki, right in the back of me. But yeah, I love Paul Wallace.
You'll hear more about this. Yeah, really interesting. Okay, so book number 10 is by a hero of yours, The Human Race. Get Off Your Knees, The Lion Sleeps No More, David Icke, published in 2010.
Yeah, I think David Icke's a mystic. And I think most mystics are conspiracy theorists. I mean, you would call Jesus that in his day, ye are gods, who are you to say that, says the mainstream, and he got crucified for it. But he really just, I always felt like something's not right, and I think intuitively I felt that, and he gave me a lot of insight and answers to my questioning. And so I think he's a courageous person. I love how he used other mystics and great minds in his book, and he quoted them, and like Osho and Rumi and Gandhi and, those rebels as well. And really talking about our true nature as well in that book, that we are conscious awareness, we are God, which the ego can't comprehend because it lives in this conscious separation. But really pointing the finger and questioning on all these politicians and these elites, this hidden hand that this evilness that's going on, that's controlling the masses. So he really just gave me a lot of food for thought. And when 2020 came around, I wasn't in fear. I seen a lot of everyone in their dream, but David Icke, through that book, really gave me that education I needed, and that understanding that something might be a little bit more going on behind the scenes. So I wasn't on survival mode. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't buying all this toilet paper like everyone.
I remember when David Icke came out, so to speak, after he had his revelation, and he had been a journalist. And I remember what the British press did to him at that time. I mean, they crucified him. And to see now, what are we, 30 or more years later, that he's still around. And in fact, he's getting more and more, attention and traction. And now some of those same people that ridiculed him are coming to him for answers.
You're right. I remember watching a video of him in the 90s being laughed at for saying he's the son of God. And he could barely get a few people to sit and listen to him, and now he's filling up arenas. So people like him and yourself and many others have been paving the way. So I really appreciate both of you.
Thank you for that. I wouldn't say I fill stadiums or anything like that, but you have to admire somebody who faces that kind of vilification and just keeps putting one foot in front of the other relentlessly, day after day, year after year. And that's the only way to do it. But many people couldn't cope with it.
You're right. And again, the mystics were crucified in some kind of way, and he's been crucified through the media. Miser Eckhart, same thing, through his own superiors, kind of crucified him in their own way. And it's just been the story down the ages with these mystics. And he's labeled a conspiracy theorist.
Well, thinking back on it now, a very good answer to those people who laughed at him when he said he was the Son of God would be, and you're crucifying me just like the Son of God. Yeah. So that's your 10 best list. It's a fabulous list, and I love everything that you've said, and I encourage people to go to the website and read, in their entirety, the descriptions that you gave, because, there's far more information that you've given about these books and how they influenced you. I want to know a bit more about you now. What made you decide to become a podcast host?
My intuition. I feel like 5 years ago, I've been told to put a podcast out, because the way I was brought up, we didn't have this information. I wanted to try to change the story. When I was a kid, I remember being, I was identified with more of being the body and the Mexican kid. And I would watch Hollywood, and they would be, the only time I seen a guy like me was when he was a convict, he was illiterate, or he was a rapist or a drug dealer or a gang member, or so I wanted to change the narrative. Like, that's not, and because I got to see how much that affected me, those subliminal messages that these elites in Hollywood were putting out to control a certain collective. And so I see how much that affected me. So I wanted to change the narrative on that.
And that's why you decided to become a podcast host.
One of the reasons. Plus I just wanted to speak to great minds like yourself and others that I love learning from. I really do. And you've been doing this before it got really trendy. So I really appreciate that about you, and being able to put these great minds out, and just having some great conversations with like Neil Donald Walsh or Marianne, or you and Sean, Father Sean, Matthew Fox, Penny Kelly. Yeah, it's just been really heart touching.
It's it's a wonderful thing, and it's a privilege, isn't it, to be able to speak to these people and to be able to share their wisdom. I think more than anything, it's about the sharing for me. I'm enwrapped when I'm talking to some of these people, and I want other people to feel what I'm feeling. Of course, not everybody will, but it's that just we have to share it.
You're right, and I come into each episode with just learning from someone. I'm willing to learn. I'm an open book, and it's really hard when you have an awakening. At least for me, it's been in my experience to have friends to actually talk to. I wear a Raider hat, but I know nothing about the Raiders anymore. You know, it's been hard for me to really just connect with people where you feel so connected to them, but they see that I'm a boring person to them, if that makes sense. I'm not into the things that they are into anymore.
How did you had your awakening, um, this incredible shift. You joined AA, and that, gave you many things that you needed at the time. Did you find it hard to move away from that? Because I would imagine that after your awakening, as you've just kind of described, you didn't fit into the old mold. You didn't fit with the people that maybe you would have mixed with before. So you find this new tribe in AA. To leave that behind voluntarily is not an easy thing to do. We all need friends, we all need to engage in community. How did you find that experience?
It was really hard because the same fellowship that taught me how to live on a spiritual basis started to condemn me for having my own experience, and they would give chips to people with certain amount of time of sobriety, and it would say, to thy own self be true, but who actually really knows how to live that? That's really hard. And you get judged for it. You get judged to question and to think broader than the mainstream or thinking of the group. So it was really hard because you're taught if you leave, you die. There's a lot of limiting beliefs, and it's not that the people are trying to be, mean or negative, or it's just it's unconscious, I believe. And so, like, some people would say in a share, AA is like the mafia: if you leave, you die. Or once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. If you stop doing this thing, you may drink again, and to drink is to die. And that's not necessarily true. I think if you actually have a real transformation, a real awakening, you're so much beyond that. You're no longer that, as a matter of fact.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? How something that is empowering after a time can become disempowering.
You're right.
And it's an incredible aid. I mean, it's done a fantastic job for so many people. And there comes a time, it's like, they say that, a good teacher knows when it's, what they're working for is for their student to surpass them and then move on. But a lot of teachers don't like that. They don't want the student to surpass them. They want them to remain the student. And that keeps the teacher relevant. And I think, what you're saying, and, I may get a lot of flack for this because what do I know about AA? But, it has been a fantastic aid for people. But what you're saying is it's a little bit of narrow-mindedness. And this happens in several, it's like teachers who get loads of followers, but they don't want their followers to graduate from their particular school. It's you've got to be able to trust that what you have given that person is now theirs to do with whatever they need to do with it and move on. Because if you don't, then you're keeping them in prison, basically.
No, you're right. And I like what Penny Kelly says. She says religion's for beginners. and that's good for the beginning stage, is to go to AA and learn how to utilize the basics. But to get trapped in it and think I need this for the rest of my life, or I need some kind of sponsor for the rest of my life, I'm still telling myself something's wrong with me. So I had to let go of that stuff. It was very helpful at the time, but Lao Tzu says it best: to learn something every day is knowledge, to let go of something every day is wisdom. So I had to let go of a lot of these old beliefs that was my truth in the very beginning, but they weren't empowering me. As I started to grow, I had to let go of that stuff. So you're right.
When you look back over your life and you contemplate the person that you were, the person that was addicted, the person that was taking drugs, what do you think and feel for that person?
Compassion. Compassion. I hear people always say they need to forgive themselves, but again, I never had to do that because that's still using the mind. I think I had to have understanding. I had to realize like the deepest resentments I had with my parents. They did the best they could with the tools they had. Even questioning their life, what did they go through? When I started understanding my own traumas, my own wrong perceptions, my own fears and mental conditioning, I could have somewhat of an understanding of the next person, like my mother and father, and that dissolved all that hate, that anger, that resentment, because understanding is love's other name. I totally agree with that. Or Wayne Dyer says, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. And when I started to put people on the stage in my mind who I resented and see and sit in the audience, because the big book says in the fourth step, be prepared to look at things from an entirely different angle. I send this and I replayed the incident that I resented them, the experience, and to see how I wanted them to treat me, and see what I was fearful of, what do I'm in fear of losing or not getting, and how do I want this person to act in front of everyone in the crowd. And it gave me a better understanding of the persona I was portraying and what created the persona. And that all that dissolved. Awareness is like the sun, like Thich Nhat Hanh says. When it truly shines forth on you, it'll grow. It'll help you grow and transform you. So that's what it did for me.
And many teachers will say that when we change something, we change it back in time. Have you noticed any changes in your parents, in the people that you knew, because you changed?
That's a good question. I don't attract things like I used to that may be harmful or negative. I don't think the world had to change for me to be okay. I do. And, I love my mother today. I tell her I love her every time I talk to her. I never did that before. I became aware of like the negative jokes I would say in front of people because I was still hurt with some of the stuff I experienced with her when my dad was in prison. I have a different relationship. So I think you're right. I have a totally different relationship with my mother, and she doesn't have to fit my image. I get to love her for who she is.
Yeah. So what do you want your life now to be about? What is your imperative? What gets you out of bed every day? What do you want to leave behind? When I say leave behind, not forget, I mean leave behind as your legacy.
I want this world to be a little bit better because I lived in it. Not in an egotistical way, but in a loving way. Like, I want to kind of, Gandhi says, be the change you wish to see in the world. But I think to understand that, you got to be connected with the mind and the heart. And I just want to be a better example for my loved ones, my family members, and the people around me. I think when you find heaven within yourself, heaven will shine on those around you. And just trying to be the change you wish to see in the world, and just a more loving, more in harmony with one another, awakening, helping people awaken from that illusion of separateness. So I don't know. I think just being more of the solution than the problem that we see today. I always say an unconscious person is easily changed by the world. An awakened individual becomes the change for the world.
That's a great phrase. That really is. So 2 questions then. The first is, of all the people that, whose books you've put on this list, if you could have dinner with any one of them, who would it be?
I think it would be Thich Nhat Hanh.
I thought you were going to say that.
He was just a beautiful experience. I think we put Jesus and the Buddha, and they become like these superheroes in the mind, but in reality they're very similar, in my opinion, to Thich Nhat Hanh. And I think a lot of Matthew Fox was saying how the Vatican labeled him the Antichrist, and he becomes a blasphemous, but he was a real treasure for humanity, in my opinion. The Jesus and Buddha were brothers, he says.
Well, I think it was about a year or so ago. On Times asked me to put together a list of the top 20 books that had been recommended over and over again by people who were guests on the show, and Thich Nhat Hanh was right up there. He wasn't in the top 5, but the person whose books, not just one book, but overall, whose whole body of work was mentioned most often was Thich Nhat Hanh. Yeah.
Wow.
So one book didn't get into the 5, but several of his books had been recommended over and over and over again.
Wow. I hope to go to his Plum Village one day in France.
So the second question: if you were a book, and you've got lots of books on the shelf behind you, and that there are always words, whether they're endorsements or even a single word that says revelation or gripping or whatever, what book would describe you? What word, would describe you if you were a book?
Well, I'm actually writing one right now, and what comes to mind for me is Awakening Within, Understanding the Human Condition.
And how would you describe that? Because if you are the book, we have to have a description for you, a word that describes you.
That's a good question. Understanding. Because that's what I try to do every day, even in any situation I'm in, when I'm angry or I'm just confused or I don't appreciate certain behaviors in someone. I just try to have understanding, even with myself, like what caused that for me to have this emotional reaction. So I really utilize understanding on a daily basis. I need to.
And I have a third question, actually. I lied. Spiritual gangster. What does it mean?
I had a dream when I was a young kid. And I don't know if you knew the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. He was a serial killer in Los Angeles. And I had 2 back-to-back dreams. These days, I don't remember my dreams, but when I was a kid, I had all kinds of outer body experiences and stuff like that. But I remember one dream was Richard Ramirez calling me to go into the sewer, and it was really dark. I seen snakes and rats, and it was just really slimy and scary. And he's calling me to go inside this sewer, and above the sewer was a gate ready to shut if I walked in. The next dream I had was me with a bunch of gang members walking down the street. And during this time on this street was a lot of murdering, a lot of shooting, a lot of drive-bys. People were killing each other. And we didn't know how to experience that kind of stuff as kids, but that's what we were experiencing. And I'm taking all these gang members, these very active gang members were all following me. And I walk into this room like the one I'm in now. And on 3 sides of this room are green plants, like, I don't know the name of that plant, but on one side of the room was all light, like in the sky. And I seen a character speaking to me in a robe. Didn't see his face because the light was shining past his face. My automatically thinking was Jesus, because that's what I'm conditioning what the divine is. But I don't know, but I took everyone to the light. So I think being a spiritual gangster is being a little bit of radical, like the mystics, and challenging mainstream thinking, and but still being loving and kind and caring for humanity and guiding people to.
Like that, and I think it's yeah.
Thank you.
So can you tell us, before you go, where can viewers find you and your interviews?
On YouTube, Broader Lens Podcast. Yeah, I'm on YouTube, and I'm also on Instagram, Broader Lens Podcast. So
you don't have a website? No?
I don't, unfortunately. I got to put one together.
And if somebody wanted to contact you, how would they reach you?
BroaderLensPodcast@gmail.com.
Booboo Garcia, thank you so much for adding your 10 best list to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's library of recommendations. It's a valuable contribution.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. Well, that's it for this week. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer. I'll be back at the same time next week with another 10 Best interview for the No BS Spiritual Book Club. Till then, it's goodbye from me, and thank you again to Booboo Garcia.
Thank you.